Hey everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Garage. This video is covering a new topic on this channel because we're going to be looking at remote administration. Now this video is going to focus on RustDesk with a twist, but don't worry, I can already preempt the comments. I will be touching on Guacamole either in the next video or shortly in the near future. Now this video will be different because I'll not only cover a local deployment, but I also want to cover a remote deployment using something like a mesh VPN. Now the local is going to be fine if you just use this in your home lab, i.e. you don't need to have anything like a VPS involved. However, if you do want some remote administration, it might be worthwhile sticking this in a VPS, especially if you don't have things like port forwarding enabled, or maybe you want to have the added resilience of cloud so that you can reboot servers and you'll still have administrative access through things like the server and the relay. All those terms will become clear as we get into this video. So without further ado, let's have a quick look at what remote admin is, what RustDesk is, what features it has, and then we'll jump into the configuration of both local and a cloud-based deployment. Now some of the first questions you're probably thinking of is, well, what is remote administration? Why do I need it? What's RustDesk? What can it do over something like Windows RDP? Good questions. Well, the main thing is you've got everything in one place and it's all self-hosted. So sure, if you're just using Windows machines and you want that graphical user interface, RDP is great. It's probably the best solution out there. But if you're running a home lab, odds are you're running multiple different operating systems, especially things like Linux, and actually connecting to them, you have to run things like Spice, etc. And therefore you need multiple applications to administrate all of them and gain access. Unless you're using something like Guacamole, which will be in the next video. But effectively what this provides us is a solution whereby we have a centralized server that we can connect to, store all of our credentials, we have clients on each machine, and then we can basically connect to all of them through a single interface. That's great for both productivity and also to keep things in control. Now RustDesk offers a myriad of features, both sort of security and productivity related. We'll get into that as we go through the video. Things like being able to directly connect to it, not having to go through the relay, setting one-time passwords, multi-factor authentication, all of that good stuff. Now it's worth calling out that this version I'm going to be deploying today will be the free version. The key thing really here is that we don't get a web interface on the server. Now that might sound bad, but actually you don't need that to actually get this up and running, and you probably only need that if you have more of an enterprise setup where the convenience of having a web GUI probably trumps the small price that you have to pay for this. Now it's fair to say as well that RustDesk has had some bad press, I would say, over the past year or so, but from everything I can see, most of that seems to be unfounded, that I can't really see anything that would worry me too much about it. Plus, you do have the option to obviously just self-host this locally, so you're not really going to be exposing this anywhere to the internet, for example. I think most of the concerns actually came from the relay, which we'll talk a little bit about in a moment. So some of the key features are called out here really. It works with pretty much any operating system. It has peer-to-peer encryption for all of those connections. There's no need for any privilege escalation on the clients for this to work, albeit for some of the features you will be asked for elevated privileges, but all of this is done on demand, which is great. So if you're wondering how this actually works, this diagram here should help you out. It's based upon public key encryption, whereby the clients both exchange keys to ensure that the connection is secure. There's also the notion of a relay, and that comes into effect if both clients cannot directly connect to one another. Things like a firewall rule are in the way. Now the relay works, and if we scroll down, by acting as a middleman when that peer-to-peer cannot be established. It's a bit like any of the videos you've seen on mine around mesh VPNs, whereby two clients can't talk to each other, but they both do have a connection back to the relay, and that can act as sort of the middleman to facilitate that connection. It also has the notion of punching through, so in the event of things like having firewall rules, a bit like say in Pangolin, you can actually get through firewalls and do it that way. You can almost reverse tunnel. Now that feature is particularly exciting because it actually means that we don't need to do any port forwards. I'll demonstrate that later in the video when we get onto the VPS, whereby my firewall doesn't have any of the required ports forwarded, yet we're still able to make direct connections. Now for this video I will be following the official instructions, which if you go to their website you'll see all of the ports and what they do. I have added that to my Docker Compose file, which we'll look at now, and I have added all the comments in just to make this easy for you. Do bear in mind that there are differences between the free and the pro version, but that's as simple as editing some ports in and out, and those ports are simply for the web interface for the server, which you don't get on the free version. You'll be able to uncomment those in my Docker Compose file if you do want to pony up for a license. Obviously, if you're going to be doing this remotely as well, these ports will need to be port forwarded somehow. So here's the Docker Compose for setting up RustDesk. Now, all it takes really is two containers. We've got the S, HPBS for server, and the R for the relay. So the server is the bit that does all of the brains, and the relay is basically there to facilitate connections that can't be peer-to-peer. So if you have a quick look through this, we're simply pulling the latest server image. We're setting up a volume. Now you can choose to use the network mode of host, which will automatically basically negate the need for setting up these ports, but I prefer to just do this discreetly and have my control over all the ports I want to forward. We've set up the network for RustDesk, which both of these containers will sit on, and then we've specified the ports. Now you can see here exactly what these ports are doing. Basically all of them are TCP ports, apart from this 116 port here, which is UDP, and that's basically used for the ID registration. So when we first put a new client on, and I'll demonstrate this later, when we first do that connection, etc., we need to be able to connect on this port. Now this server, for the relay to work, depends on that relay container being up. And then if we have a look at the relay container, it's pretty much the same story. We're using the same data volume, we're putting it onto that RustDesk network again, and then we're specifying a couple of additional TCP ports here. So that's pretty much it. It really is that simple to get this up and running. So let's hop into the terminal now, let's fire up this container, and then let's get on to actually using this before we move on to setting this up in a more remote VPN tunnel environment. So quickly deploying those containers, we can see that those have started. Now if I head over into my Portainer instance, I'll have a look now and see what's happening in the logs. Now if we scroll down, we'll see here the HPBR and the HPBS. If we look in the relay, we can see that that's all up and running and everything's ready to accept and receive connections. Heading back to the actual HPBS though, this is the bit that we want, because if we go into here, you can see that we've generated some keys. And this is what we need here, this value, for actually joining our first clients. Now we're going to download the client in a moment, but bear in mind you will need this. You don't need to get this through Portainer. You can obviously get this from the container logs, so run a docker logs and put the container name in. That will give you this value. But you can also, if you're doing this in say VS Code like I am, if we have a look over in the actual folder that we're deploying this from, you'll see here that we've got this ID underscore and it's the .pub, so it's the public key. And you can see here we've got that exact same value. So however you want to go and grab this code, go and get it. Next up, I'm heading over to the RustDesk GitHub page where it's got the latest releases. So for this video, I'm using version 1.40, and I'm just going to be using the portable exe version that doesn't require installation. But if you do want to do the system installation, do download the MSI one, and that will install this as a service on the system. That can have benefits where you don't have to escalate privilege each time, but at the same time that could be a security risk. It's totally up to you. Now unfortunately I can't appear to make this any larger, but when you open that executable file, this is what you will get. Now ignore these two here, that's a sneak peek of what we're going to be doing in a moment. These are just remembered connections from two virtual machines that I've spun up. But effectively, when you first come into the application, you get the ID of this machine, so this is the machine I'm currently recording on, and a one-time password that you'll need to enter. For example, if you're on a different machine and you wanted to connect to this one I'm on, you will need this password here. Now, if we actually head over into the settings, and you can do that by clicking the three dots up here, we first want to connect this to our server that we've just spun up in Docker. So we want to head to the network tab, and then we want the ID, relay, and server. And in here, we're going to put our IP addresses. That's for the ID and the relay server. Bear in mind that those could be different. In this instance, it's the same. but it could be different. For example, if you wanted your relay on a different network, maybe in a DMZ that was externally accessible. So do bear that in mind and think about where you're going to put this that makes sense for your use case. You also don't have to have the relay server if you're just going to be using this internally, and everything's going to be controlled through your firewall. Lastly, we need to put in the key, and that key is what we just saw in the logs. And when you click OK, you should get a successful, and if you go back to the home, you should see now that we are ready. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will probably note that this is not a local IP address. And spoiler alert, this is because I have this currently configured to something we're going to do later in the video, which is set this up on a VPS. So I'm going to put this back now to my local server, which is on that 200.50, and I'm going to copy the key from that server instead of the key that's currently in there, which is for that remote server. So that should look like, if we get rid of this, paste that in, hit OK, we should now be connected to my local server whereby these will work. So let's have a quick look through the remaining settings before we actually get to setting up a client. So if we go into settings, we've got a few things that are important. Obviously the first thing is dark mode. But more seriously, there are things around the hardware codec you can use for those actual video sessions, so the video acceleration is going to put on those, and you can choose some other things like how this is actually rendered. If we go to security, this is where it gets a bit more interesting. We can enable and disable various things when we are actually connected to these remote machines. So for maybe data loss prevention, we could disable the clipboard, things like that. We don't want to be able to connect to remote printers, those sorts of things. Now going down, we can also say, do we want to use one-time passwords and how long are those? That's this thing over here. Or do we want to set a permanent password? Now for a home lab, I probably recommend doing a permanent password, and probably for anything at scale as well, you might want to set permanent passwords per machine. But you decide what's best for you. You might also want to enable multi-factor authentication as well to connect to that device. So you'd need a second factor, not just the password, in the event that if that was compromised, they still wouldn't have access to that machine. Now we get down onto the security section, and you can enable direct IP access. So that's operating by default on port 21118. And if you do apply that, it will give you a UAC prompt, certainly in Windows, and it also asks for your password in Linux. But what that allows you to do is a bit like the Windows RDP session that's baked into sort of your Windows Pro. That will allow you to do a direct IP connection that's encrypted. Otherwise, if you don't allow this option, it will default to going through the relay, which does have a performance hit because it's an extra hop in the chain. You can do some restrictions using IP whitelists down here, but also probably a better place would be to manage this through your firewall with traditional firewall rules. You've got some options around what you want to do for scaling of the display and also the video codec that you're going to use. The account is for if you have a pro version of this. And then you can also have some settings around the printer, if it has a printer on a remote machine, for example, or you've got a printer on your machine that you want to share to others on the network. So now let's go to the home and let's have a look at these two machines. Well, thankfully, one's Linux and one's Windows. So let me fire up Proxmox just to show you what those machines look like. So these machines are nothing fancy. These are two virtual machines I've spun up in my cluster. One is just that RustDesk Linux demo, and the other one is Windows. There's nothing fancy about this. I've just gone through the same process for setting these up as you would do for any default installation. Now, if we actually click on the console here, you can actually see here I've got that Windows 11 machine, and in the background I've got that James Linux Ubuntu machine. So basically this is using the console for Proxmox, but again, that's not as feature rich, it's not as great an experience because it's through a web browser as something like using RustDesk. So what you need to do now is go onto both of these respective machines, log into them, and then you want to download the exact same client, but for obviously the right operating system that we just did on my Windows machine. Once you've done that, you'll obviously now have this installed, so RustDesk installed on the Windows machine, and RustDesk installed on this one behind me, this Ubuntu machine. And again, you're going to get that ID and that code. Now, what we can do is, for that first time, and again, this is where it's useful to perhaps set a static password, because this will be random each time you run this application. And therefore, you'll have to kind of remote in first to get that password and then go back in. So now, clearing my desktop, and this is back on this machine that I am recording this video. That's those two machines here. You can see that both of those are green and up and running. What you need to do is basically put in the ID in here and click connect, and then it's going to prompt you for your password. Subsequent connections, once you've already connected, it will drop down to here. So let's test that out. So we know for this Linux machine that the password was PNNEUR. So if I double click this one here, hopefully if I click OK, you can now see that we've connected to that virtual machine. Now handily at the top, we can actually click this little drop down bar here, and we can click the display button, and then we can do something like scale adaptive. Now bear in mind that this machine is just running completely virtual GPU. It doesn't have a dedicated GPU, so the GPU performance is always going to be quite bad on it. Now that we've got the display somewhat sorted, let's see how snappy it is. Now this feels a little bit sluggish. Now let's have a look at the top, because if we look here we can see this symbol and we can see that it's actually relayed. Sorry again that the display is quite small. Now to fix that, what we can do is we can click on this application here, and we should be able to again go into the settings itself. We will need to disconnect actually first to get into the settings, so let me do that quickly. So if we close this connection down again, and then I open up that virtual connection that's through Proxmox. If we go into the settings here and we go to security, let's unlock the security settings, and this is putting in my Linux password. I need to make sure that I've got enable direct IP access enabled, and we need to put in the port that we expect, which is 21118, and then hit apply. Now let's try and reconnect, but this time hopefully it's going to get a direct connection. So now after a quick restart of the service on Ubuntu, you'll see now that we've actually got this green tick, which is direct and encrypted connection. Perfect. So let me just close down this connection here, and let's fire up the Windows one just so you can see what that looks like. But no surprises, it's going to look exactly the same. So grabbing that password, hitting OK, you can see we're now into that Windows machine. And again, we can adaptively scale this up. And you can see as well that here you go, we are connected directly. Perfect. So that pretty much is all you need to get this up and running. We now have a single client on my machine that I'm recording on, and I can connect seamlessly to both Windows and Linux machines. So let's mix this up a bit. Let's go and deploy this now into a VPS, and then we can start the process of using things like VPNs. So here I fired up a virtual machine on Hetzner. Now you can choose whichever cloud provider you want to use, but basically create a virtual machine. In this instance, I've created just a bare bones one, and I've installed Docker onto this virtual machine. Other important things are to put in a firewall rule. So here you can see I created this firewall, and in here I've got the ports that it expects. So that 21.15 in TCP up to 1.9, and that special 16 port that's on UDP. So with that applied and the containers up and running in Docker, we should be able to now connect to this. And so here you can see I connected to this machine just through PuTTY this time. I basically copy and pasted the same compose file, the exact same one as I used in the local video, so the one that we've just deployed now. It pulled the container, it spun it up, and then I checked and I got this code here for actually connecting to it. So again, that's that public key. So basically all I need to do now is get that key, and we need to basically head back into the client, and instead this time I'm going to put the IP address of this virtual machine, and I'm going to steal that key, and we should be able to connect to it. So if we head now back into Rust and we go into the settings, we go to the network. This time we need to change these IP addresses. So in this case it's that 157.180.30.174. And we want to copy and paste in here the key for this server, which we just got from the logs on that machine. I'll change the relay as well because that's the same, and I should be able to hit OK, and then if we go back to home, we can see again that we're ready. Now you'll notice then that those went from green to being amber. And that's because now we basically don't have a connection to these, because both of these are using the local server, that local relay local server, not the one that I've just deployed in the cloud here. So I'm going to go into each of these respective machines, and I'll do that just through my Proxmox console. For example, I'll go into this Windows one here, and I'll repeat that exact same process. So I'm going to go into here, I'm going to go to the network, the ID relay, and I'll put all the same details into each one. Now, if you're wondering what's the easiest way to copy the credentials over onto this, I actually just mounted all of these devices onto my NAS and then created just a text document to copy all this stuff in. The actual Proxmox console doesn't allow you to copy and paste values, but you could also do it through the existing local setup you have of RustDesk, because that has a clipboard enabled. One thing that can actually be handy as well is this is connected to the machine, again the physical machine I'm recording on now. You can actually click copy here, and that will create basically a string out of all of these details. So you don't need to put them all in. You can copy that string and then paste the string in. So for example, if I edit that file I just showed in the background, this one here that's on my NAS, here you can see that new text document. If I just paste that in and click save, hopefully now if I go back to this virtual machine, I can click this here. I can now copy all of that. And then hopefully if I go into the ID relay server and I hit paste, you can see it updated all those values, and hopefully I can click OK, click home, and yeah, ready. We're now connected to that cloud instance over here in Hetzner. So I'm going to go and do the exact same process now just for that Ubuntu virtual machine. And so now back on this physical machine I'm on, the one I'm recording my video on, you can see here now that both of those have gone back to green. Now these should still be able to determine that they're on the local network and get a direct IP connection. But now we can actually click the dots and say we could always connect via a relay. And now what that would do is obviously send it over to this VPS in the background and connect through that relay. So one thing we can quickly do to test that out in terms of using the relay is, let's go into my firewall and I'll remove the firewall rules that allows local direct connections, thus forcing it through the relay, just to make sure that we are connecting now through the VPS and we've still got connectivity. Now, as I mentioned before, actually having that relay is a way to circumvent existing firewall rules. So this machine I'm recording on is on VLAN 7, and typically this has access to my whole network. Now, both of those virtual machines that I showed earlier, the Windows and the Ubuntu machine, those are actually on VLAN 200. So I'm going to enable this rule, and what this will do is basically this machine I'm on now, it's going to block all traffic going to those virtual machines. Now, what that should do is if we go back to RustDesk, these should still remain online as it's showing they are, but I shouldn't be able to do direct connections. So for something like RDP on just sort of a traditional Home Pro version of Windows, you wouldn't be able to connect, there's no direct IP access. But now thankfully, because we've got that relay up in the cloud, and all of these virtual machines have internet access, we should be able to connect back into those machines via the relay. So here you can see automatically I'm not going to actually bother connecting, because we've already demonstrated it's asking for a password, i.e. it's got a connection. You can see up here it's got that relay symbol. So we know now that this machine here, which doesn't have direct IP access to this machine, is now forcing that connection through the relay. So hopefully you're now starting to see how if you mix up your topology in your network, you can start to break this up, add layers of security into it. And you can also then add things like tunnels onto that VPS, and you can also then add things like mesh VPNs. Now, what's also really interesting is in my firewall, in OpenSense here, but it doesn't really matter, I don't have any port forwards for RustDesk. So how's it working? Well, if you remember back to that original diagram, that's where that hole punching comes in. So effectively, because these two virtual machines here are connecting out to the relay, it basically reverse tunnels that and allows connections from the VPS, that server, that relay, back into this machine. So that's why I can now connect to these machines via the relay, and I don't have to worry about doing any port forwarding. It's basically already created that tunnel for us. But what if we want to take our security a step further, and we don't want this to be externally exposed? In fact, we want to restrict this, but we also want to get the benefits of having this hosted in a VPS that's outside of our infrastructure, so we can reboot internal servers without losing connectivity. Well, that's where something like a mesh VPN will come in handy. So let's move on to now deploying this with also the benefits of the mesh VPN. This will allow things like direct connections, i.e. point to point over that mesh VPN network, but also making sure that everything's restricted so that only we can have access to it. Nothing is going to be publicly available on that VPS. will remove all of the firewall rules and really restrict this down. So we can do that quite simply, and I've got videos on mesh VPNs with Tailscale and Netbird, so I'm not going to go into the theory and all of the detail. Please go check those videos out, but I am going to be following that process now quickly and showing you the end result. The end result is that if we deploy the Tailscale client onto all of our machines, so the VPS, the 2 virtual machines I've showed, and then basically any other clients you want to access this, we should then be able to do direct connections as well to those machines through the mesh VPN, but we can also isolate the entire RustDesk server within a VPN that anyone without VPN access simply can't get to. So I'm going to go now quickly and install Tailscale onto all these virtual machines. So setting up Tailscale, and you'll get these instructions when you log into your account. It's as simple as just pasting in the friendly commands, and then hopefully within a few seconds you should have Tailscale up and running. And so hopefully now running sudo Tailscale up, you can see that we've got this up and running. And after completing that, you can see now that this Linux machine is connected to that Tailscale network. So I'm going to repeat that process both for the VPS and also for the Windows 11 machine, and I'll show you what that looks like when it's completed. And so after a short while, you can see here I've got the first one here. This is my home PC I'm recording on. The one down is the Linux VM, the next one is the Windows VM, and this bottom one here is that Hetzner VPS. So great, all of them are now connected onto that mesh VPN. So now we can get on to the next stage of this, and importantly, we've got the IP addresses here. This is everything we're going to need. So I'm going to go back onto Hetzner now, and I'm going to delete the firewall rules that are allowing me to connect currently through that relay, i.e. breaking out into the internet because all those ports are forwarded. That's how we're able to connect to the VPS. If I remove those firewall rules, those virtual machines should lose access to the relay. Let's go and test that quickly, and then we're going to replace the IP address of the server with these Tailscale IP addresses. So back on Hetzner, let's go over to the firewall. Let's click on this one here, and I'm going to remove all of these rules. So I'll remove that rule, I'll remove that rule, and so all we've got now is ping and basically port 22 for SSH. Let's click save, and then that's now applied. So hopefully now if I go back to the RustDesk that's on this machine, after a little while I suspect that these will no longer be ready and these won't be green because they now cannot connect to that server. The firewall rules aren't letting them through. So just quickly restarting that just to force it, you can see now that when we load this machine up, it says it's connecting to the network and none of these devices are online. That's exactly what we'd expect. That's because now on this Hetzner machine, there's no firewall rules that are allowing it access to that machine. So what we can actually do now is change that to use the Tailscale network. So let's go back into the settings here, and then we're going to go down to network and this ID relay. Now this key should be the same, but what we need to do is change this IP address here to those IP addresses I showed you in the Tailscale website. Now in this instance, we want this 177.6.120. So we'll copy that address and we'll head back now into the RustDesk client and we'll add that IP address. So now hopefully if we put this value in and we hit OK, fingers crossed we go back to home and we're now connected to the server. Perfect. Now remember, all of this is going through Tailscale. Nothing is externally available. No one has access to that Rust server. Now I'm going to repeat the same process. I'm going to go back into these two machines here and I'll add this IP address for the VPS using the Tailscale IP, and fingers crossed we should get the exact same experience before, and we should even be able to access them via the direct IP method, not via the relay, even though it's all going out the cloud anyway. So now those two machines have been altered to use the Tailscale IP address. I'm also going to add in my firewall rule on this machine I'm recording on. I'm going to go back into OpenSense and I'm going to block all traffic to that 200 network just in case it tries to pick up that route instead. So back in OpenSense, I'm going to enable that blocking rule and I'm going to hit apply. And so now anything from this network is blocking that one there. And so now with any luck, hopefully I can connect to this Windows machine. So let's double click. And yes, excellent. It's asking for the password and it's also showing up here that this is a direct connection, and that's through that Tailscale network. So let me quickly grab the password for this and then we're going to log in. Put in the password in here and hitting return. Bingo, I'm now logged into that Windows virtual machine And this is all running through the RustDesk, which is running through the VPS over Tailscale. And as you can see, we've got a direct connection. And I've just showed that that firewall rule would not allow me to access this unless I was on that Tailscale network. Just to make sure that the Ubuntu one is also working, let's give that a try. So yep, that looks good. We've got a direct connection. Let's stick the password in here and hopefully we get the exact same experience. So adding that password, you can see now that we've connected into this machine and we're also directly connected. So hopefully you are now able to replicate this setup, and you can basically choose whichever option you want. You can go down the route of just setting this up locally. That's probably how I will set this up. Whether I choose this or Guacamole, to be determined. Or you could go down the route of adding it into the cloud and securing it through something like a mesh VPN. That's cool because, again, products like Tailscale are free, and if you don't want to use Tailscale, there are open source alternatives like NetBird and Headscale that you can also use. That gives you basically the benefit of having this all local, i.e. it's on your VPN that you control, and it means that no one else can get access to it. It also has the benefit of obviously the relay being in the cloud, which means that if you close down certain machines, do some maintenance here, hopefully that cloud machine is going to remain up and you've still got that availability to come in and administer your devices. Do let me know if this is something that you're going to spin up. Tell me your experiences of Rust Server. Are you a pro user? Is it worth it? Just keen to see what the perception of this solution is. As I mentioned, I am going to be looking at Guacamole in the next or very soon upcoming videos, and I'm really keen to put these head to head and see which one I prefer. I'll be covering the same network provisioning, i.e. going through VPNs, etc. in that video, so do get familiar with these concepts. Anyway, if you've liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe. I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.